Hello, Iain.
Hello, Ludovic.
It's
Very good to be here.
oh yes, it's wonderful to have you on the show. I checked your videos and books for a long time, and it's delicacy. It's really wonderful to read your words. So I will try to make a little presentation of your background.
Sure.
You're a psychiatrist,
Yes.
neuroscience researcher, philosopher, and a literary scholar. And
Yes.
so it's quite a wide range of knowledge.
I
And
have been called all these things, yes.
and these influences have shaped your work on perception and human experience.
Yes.
And your first major book, The Master and His Emissary, in 2009,
That's right.
explores the roles of the brain's hemispheres in shaping our understanding of the world.
Yes.
And you published a second book, monumental one, The Matter with Things, in 2021. And you go further on this book within neuroscience, philosophy, uh, ancient wisdoms, and for exploring reality, perception, and sacredness and values.
Mm, mm.
And to begin with, for my first question, could you explain the primary differences between the left and right hemispheres of the brain and their ways of perceiving the world?
Yes, I will. The first thing to say is that people need to put out of their minds anything they've heard over the years about the difference between the hemispheres. There was a sort of pop culture understanding of this, which was a complete misunderstanding. And it went something like the left hemisphere is a little dull, but it's dependable, it uses reason, and so forth. Whereas the right hemisphere is a little creative, but unreliable, and so forth. The first thing is that both hemispheres are involved in everything. So each hemisphere is involved in reason and in language and in the visuospatial realm. And so all those things need to be put aside. So what is the difference? It's not a difference in the what, it's a difference in the how. In other words, they each take a role in everything we do, but that role is consistently quite different. Why? Well, the answer to this is an evolutionary one, that one of the primary problems for any living creature is how to get food without itself becoming food for something else. So while you're getting your lunch, you don't want to become somebody else's lunch. And this requires two different kinds of attention at once. And the solution to that is to have two separate neuronal masses, each of which is capable of sustaining awareness of the world. And this goes not just for humans, but for mammals, for reptiles, amphibians, even for some lower forms of life, such as insects. So, I mean, they don't have brains exactly, but they do have neural ganglia. But this division is important because you have to do two things at once. One is see something that you want, locate it, and go for it very quickly and precisely. So it targets something that it already knows, that is completely decontextualized. It's just a thing that I know and I want, and to focus on it very sharply and move towards it quickly so as to grab it and get it. And so important is that pretty much the whole of the way that the left hemisphere, because it is the left hemisphere that does this, that controls for us the right hand, which for most of us is the hand with which we do the grabbing and the getting. So important is this, that this is largely the sole mode of the left hemisphere, utility, how to use the world, how to manipulate the world, how to have power over it and control it, but not to understand it. While the left hemisphere is focusing on what it wants to get, the other hemisphere has to take in everything else, the whole big picture, because it's looking out for a predator, it's looking out for your mate, it's looking out for your offspring. So it's seeing the whole picture. And this means that these two kinds of attention could be characterized as piecemeal, fragmentary, isolating, decontextualized, abstracting in the left hemisphere, and connected, always connected. The right hemisphere sees that nothing is really ever isolated from everything else, that nothing is ever fixed so that it can grab it, but it's actually constantly changing, flowing, in process. That the things that matter are often implicit, whereas the left hemisphere gets only the explicit meaning, the obvious meaning. But in the realms of things that matter to us, it's often the implicit that matters, and it's the right hemisphere that gives us that. And the left hemisphere sees an inanimate world, whereas the right hemisphere sees an essentially animate world. And probably the least exciting difference, but the most important one, can be stated like this. The left hemisphere sees only a representation of the world. A representation means literally something that is present again after the fact, when it in fact is no longer present. But the right hemisphere allows things to presence to it. In English, there isn't a verb to presence. Presence is a noun. But I'm using a Heideggerian term, Anwesen, and he derived that from what was also a noun, the presence. But he had this idea that things come into being for us when we attend to them. I think it's a very important concept, because I think attention changes the world. And for that reason, it's a moral act. So the left hemisphere has a representation, something like a diagram or a map, that excludes almost everything. But it's powerful just because it excludes almost everything. If a map had a lot of detail, it wouldn't be useful anymore. Whereas the right hemisphere is not mapping the world, it is actually allowing it to presence in all its manifold richness, in all that is implicit as well as explicit, and in a seamless whole, whereas the left hemisphere sees only parts. I hope that sets the scene.
Yeah, that's really clear. And it seems that in your work, you criticize maybe the dominance of left hemisphere thinking in shaping our view of reality. Is that a good explanation of your work?
Yes, it is a further consequence of my observation that these hemispheres see the world differently, that two kinds of world are available to us. One that is, as I say, full of things that we want to get for personal gain, where things are clear-cut, black and white, as we say. There are no shades of meaning there. The implicit has been lost. The animate has been lost. And we believe that we're living, but in fact all we're doing is scrutinizing a map. Whereas in the right hemisphere, things come alive and we experience them. I was very impressed by a psychologist, an American psychologist and philosopher called Louis Sass. And not Thomas Zaz, but Louis Sass, S-A-S-S. And he wrote a book called Madness and Modernism. And what he was suggesting was that a lot of the way in which we experience the world in the last 100 years, since modernism began, is rather like the way that a schizophrenic subject sees the world. And schizophrenics, one way of looking at the way they see the world, it's not the full story, but it's an important part of the story, is that it's as though their right hemisphere is not really working properly, and they are trying to compensate for that by overusing the left hemisphere. So they get a sort of mechanistic view of things in which they don't understand what motivates people, and they don't test reality well. They're prone to delusions and hallucinations. So I thought this was very interesting because he's a beautiful writer and knows a lot about culture as well as psychology. And this book was so convincing, I thought to myself, have there been times in history when things have been better balanced? Of course, there have. Have there been previous times when the left hemisphere seemed to dominate? I think there have. And so in the second half of The Master and His Emissary, and in the title, I'm referring to the fact that the right hemisphere is the master. It's the one that understands, that knows. The left hemisphere is an emissary, in other words, somebody who goes about doing business on behalf of the master. And it's a very good emissary, but a very poor master. And it's when it becomes the master that civilizations fall apart. And in the second half of that book, The Master's Emissary, I really trace Western history from early Greece through to postmodernism. And I think broadly, very broadly, there have 3 times been an upsurge of wonderful fecundity, fertility, creativity in science, in the arts, and in human understanding of one another. And these were, in roughly speaking, the 6th century or so BC in Greece, around the year dot, as we say, around the end of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the Roman Empire, and again in the Renaissance in Europe. And at these times, everything flourished well together and the 2 hemispheres contributed as needed. But over time, in every case, the left hemisphere has become arrogant, hubristic. It has come to believe it understands everything. And when that happens, because it actually understands so very little, things go very badly astray. The culture becomes stereotypical, the life goes out of it, individuality is subsumed in categories of people, subtle, nuanced thinking is lost, and instead there is just black and white thinking. Either it's this or it's that. I must be right, and if I accept that anything you say is right, then I must be wrong. This is a very unhelpful way to be thinking. And I think the reason that they happened was because each of these empires, the Greek, the Roman, and the Western Empire, and when I say empire, I mean, yes, the British Empire and the American commercial empire, have overreached themselves and had to impose the single same pattern of things everywhere under their control. And that is where things start to go badly wrong. Creativity dies, people become feel that they have no control of their lives, and art becomes barren, stereotypical. You can see this in just looking at the Roman art as it progressed over the centuries. It didn't get more sophisticated, it got much less sophisticated until Rome collapsed. And I think we're in that time now ourselves.
Can we draw a parallel between the spiritual distinction between a dualistic, ego-driven way of experiencing the world, often considered as the root of suffering, and in the other side, a non-dual, interconnected, and participatory view of the world, which is seen as liberative. Is it? Can we draw a parallel between these 2 views with your work?
Indeed.
Yes.
Yes. And at the end of The Matter with Things, a very long book, I'm afraid, I'm leading people to a place where they may reconsider their first assumption that only people who are rather stupid or childish would believe in a realm that cannot be proved in the laboratory. So in the Anglo world, there are people like Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett and so on, who think that if you believe this sort of thing, you must be very primitive. And what I want to suggest is that it's rather the opposite, that it is extremely simple-minded to dismiss something just because you cannot demonstrate it in the laboratory. And all those things you mentioned about the interconnective nature, the non-strictly dual nature, the non-egoistic nature is more associated with the right hemisphere's understanding and the opposite with the left. And I draw on a lot of evidence of different kinds, including neurological, neuropsychological evidence about the roles of the two hemispheres there. So what we need is to, maybe I can just take things a little bit further by commenting, when you say non-dual, I think it's a mistake to think that it's as simple as all is one. You know, in the old days, there were hippies that went around going, man, it's just all one, you know. And I wanted to say, yes, and it's all many, now what, you know. So, so we need to hang on to the idea that there is differentiation, which is a glorious thing. That there each, as Henry Thoreau, the American naturalist, philosopher, and poet said, each blade of grass is individual. So everything that exists is actually individual, and we broadly group things together in categories to make it possible to generalize about the world. But actually, we are individual. And when a bud, a tightly closed bud, unfurls, suddenly what seemed like a single thing has become many, many things. There are stamens, there are petals. The beauty of the thing becomes clear. But by manifesting, it hasn't made the flower go away or be destroyed by this unfolding. In fact, it has fulfilled the flower by this differentiation, which doesn't in any way threaten its integrity. So I'd like to make a distinction between making a distinction and making a sharp division. So clearly mind and body, consciousness and matter seem to be distinct, and it would be a shame to say, well, there's really no difference. I mean, I don't think anyone would really believe that. But on the other hand, if we want to go there, I will argue that they are so closely integrated with one another that they can, in one sense, be thought of as the same thing under different aspects.
Seems like it's like a dynamic interplay between the two, or like in Buddhism or in Taoism, there's this idea of it's an interplay between consciousness and matter. So it's not we can't separate the two.
No. Well, we can distinguish between them, but we can't sunder them. We can't cut them and put them apart. So perhaps I could say something about my idea of experience, the experiential world, which is, after all, the only world we can know. I think it comes into being for us through an encounter with whatever is inside me, as I tend to think of it, although we could argue that is a false way of thinking, but in any case, my consciousness and everything else. And in that encounter, whatever it is that I can know comes into being. And I'm not saying that the mind makes up reality. I'm not saying every perception is equally true. Many perceptions are obviously completely wrong. You can be deluded, you can hallucinate, it's no problem, and you can vastly misunderstand something. But there's not just one way in which it can manifest. There's a commonality to the ways in which it manifests to different people, otherwise we wouldn't be able to talk about our experience together and for it to mean anything. But nonetheless, everything comes into being through an encounter, and that encounter is a resonance. It is a resonance relationship, in other words, one that goes both ways, in which whatever it is influences my consciousness influences it, and this is going on all the time. And so a seamless world is coming into being that is born of both my consciousness and the rest of the field. And if you'll allow me to continue, I think I've come to the conclusion that ultimately consciousness and matter can very well be distinguished, but are not wholly separate. So I take it as entirely unlikely that the brain generates consciousness, and there's a lot of reasons why that would be so. Nobody has found, to my knowledge, a satisfactory explanation of how mere matter, if it has nothing to do with consciousness, can give rise to consciousness. Of course, if matter, as I see it, already has something to do with consciousness, then it's no surprise. But it's a surprise if you imagine that matter is ever without consciousness. And I say there are really logically only three ways in which consciousness could arise in connection with the brain. The brain could emit it, which is what I've just described and what I don't believe. It could transmit it in the way that a television set transmits a signal. So it's not coming out of the set, it's coming through the set. And that is a possibility. But what I prefer is that it permits consciousness. And the best image to describe this is one given by William James about his voice. So his voice is the pressure of air from the lungs being expelled through his mouth, and he has a voice. But if he didn't have a larynx, he wouldn't be able to say anything. This would just be generic air moving around as air does. But for it to be his voice, there has to be an obstruction, something that, as it were, filters it, shapes it, and that is the larynx. All the larynx does is to obstruct, and by obstructing, it creates. And matter is like this, that matter is the form in which consciousness gives itself to the world, becomes experience, in which it has a degree of permanence that thinking on its own doesn't have. Only a degree of permanence, because nothing is forever, but nonetheless, the table at which I'm sitting denies me if I want to put my hand through it. In my thinking, I can put my hand through it, but in reality, I can't. And the other thing it provides is resistance. And I come back to this idea that resistance is actually very creative. You know, without resistance, we cannot be creative. It challenges us to find something new. And one way of thinking about this is, what is friction? Friction, according to physics, is what stops us moving. True, but it's also what starts us moving. If there were no friction, neither you nor I would be able to move. So the thing that looks to us negative can often be the secret to creation. And matter is that element in consciousness, or that way of consciousness exhibiting itself or manifesting itself in the world, that allows us to have some resistance, some creative resistance, and some creative permanence.
So if I understand well, matter would be a phenomenon in consciousness or made of consciousness, or is it too far?
No, in a way, that is exactly what I mean. But be careful not to think. I mean, people would say, okay, well, I'm sorry, I don't get that. I mean, consciousness and matter don't look like one another at all. But water and ice don't look like one another at all, and yet ice is water, just under different circumstances. So water freely moves and flows, and if you put your hand in it, it just flows past it. But a lump of ice is hard and static and and no longer translucent, it's opaque, and it's very hard. You can crack your head open. So this is quite different from water. And also in the room where you're sitting and where I'm sitting, there are literally tons of water, invisible, all around us. And if there weren't, we couldn't live and breathe. So they're all water. If you say, which of these is water? Well, I'd say, well, in a way, they're all water. It's just which phase, as scientists say, which phase of water we're talking about. So I see matter as a phase of consciousness.
That's it seems like a good analogy for it can be the non-lucid dream, where one can touch some stuff and it seems solid, it seems material, but in reality it's only a product of our consciousness. Maybe is it like that? Is it like a dream?
Not quite, because a dream can give access to hidden truths. It's certainly the case, but of course it can also be entirely deceptive. It can just be fantastical. So what I want to above all avoid saying is that we make up this reality. As I stress, it is an encounter. I am not wholly responsible for it. I can only in part responsible for it by communing with it. I can bring it into being for me and perhaps for other people. So it's fortunately, importantly, other than us. And the trouble with non-dualism is it gets away from a very important kind of dualism, that we need both non-dualism in the sense that none of these things, matter and consciousness and so on, are not wholly separate. That's what I'm saying. But we mustn't do away with the idea that they have a degree of independence from one another, that they can complement one another. I mean, if we were to go, and I don't know if you want to go there, but let us talk a little about God. And at the end of The Matter with Things, I wrote a long chapter. It's a short book in length, about 111 pages, and it's called The Sense of the Sacred. And in a way, it's the most important thing I've ever written, also the hardest thing I've ever written. And it took me over a year to write that chapter. And as we say in English, I sweated blood to bring it about. And in it, I suggest that we need to put aside many of the ideas we've inherited about the nature of God. Not all of them by any means, but that some of them are not helpful. But that whatever God is the ground of being. And I think that the ground of being is conscious. So I think consciousness is what philosophers call an ontological primitive. That's to say, it is something so foundational that you cannot go behind it. There's nothing that gave rise to it. It is the origin. And I think that creative origin is divine. And I think it's much better to think of it that way than in any other comparable way that one can make sense of it. And that in pretty much every religious tradition, that God, that ground of being, whatever, and it exists in Buddhism, and it exists in Hinduism, it exists in Christianity, obviously, and in Islam. Its nature is fundamentally loving, particularly in Christianity. And if it is to love, love is nothing if not relational. So in order to have something to love, it had to bring about something that was at least not totally under its own control. If it was totally under its own control, then nothing new or creative could happen. There could be no love originating, because love cannot be compelled. If love is compelled, it's not love. So we need a creation that can respond to what I think is beautiful, complex, good, and we sense to be true, and we are drawn to that. And So that is an essential element in all the spiritual traditions, that we are coming to know something that is revealing aspects of something very deep about the nature of reality, and that it's not chaotic, that it does have a kind of directional purpose, and that it is pregnant with values. It is perhaps even impregnated with values. Values cannot be separated from it. Mm-hmm. So that's enough to say for now, and please respond.
Oh yes, it raises two questions for me. It's is in your view the self a construct or an illusion, and what about free will?
Okay, yes, very good.
Big ones.
Two big ones, yes. We're not shy of the big ones today. The self. Well, I think when people say that the goal of a spiritual journey is to discover that there is no self, part of me consents and part of me dissents. So I think what is meant is that the ego, the selfish, acquisitive self, the self that is admiring of itself, and which is effectively underwritten by the left hemisphere, which has a very high opinion of itself, by the way, when you can isolate each hemisphere one at a time, which you can do with a certain procedure for about 20 minutes, and you ask each hemisphere to talk about itself as a personality, the left hemisphere has a very, very high opinion of itself, whereas the left hemisphere is much more realistic and, if anything, a little bit on the downside. So when compared with what friends and relatives say. So anyway, to come back to the self. So that kind of ego is, I think, different from the self. And Jung made a distinction between the ego and the self. And he thought that the ego was what you needed in early life when you were actually in the process of differentiating yourself from your mother, and then after that from others, and realizing that you have an independent existence. This doesn't make you a selfish or isolated person. It's a necessary step on becoming an individual that can, in turn, give part to and bring about the flourishing of a society. So it's once again this need for a little bit of separation or distinction and connection at the same time. The self is what results from this process when one sees that, yes, I have a self. Even the Buddha had a self. When the Buddha didn't sleep, it wasn't that I didn't sleep, it was that the Buddha didn't sleep. When the Buddha died, the Buddha died. It wasn't that I died, it was that the Buddha died. So the Buddha was a person. In Christianity, Christ was, for these purposes, as God manifested as a man, was a person. And when he was crucified, he was crucified. But nonetheless, in the whole story, this event, the events of these great people and the events of all of us really, are reflections of one and the same being. And another image that is comes from the East, from the Vedanta, is one I like, which is that of Indra's net. Indra was a god, and in that part of the mythology, there was a net over the universe, and at every intersection, every crossing point in the net is suspended a jewel, and in each jewel all the other jewels were mirrored. Now, in a way, that is a brilliant concept, because it shows that there are separate jewels, but that they are always interconnected with every other jewel and indeed reflect the other jewels. So I think there is a self, and in psychiatry, people who have no sense of themselves are very dangerous people. They're unhappy people, and at times quite destructive people. So there is a condition, you may know, I don't know what it's called in French, but in the Anglo world it's called borderline personality disorder.
That's the same.
Yeah.
The same.
And do you say that? You call it borderline?
It's borderline.
Borderline, yes. And these people, not intentionally, but cannot help behaving in ways that are profoundly destructive. And one of the core elements of borderline personality disorder is having no longer any sense of who you are. And another serious mental illness, schizophrenia, is one in which people lose their sense of themselves. So it's not a spiritual goal to lose the sense of yourself. It's, in a way, a spiritual goal to fulfill the potential that is in yourself. You were brought into the world just once to be who you are, and you need to fulfill, allow to grow the seed, the soul that is in you. And you can either stultify it, you can stunt its growth by not attending to it, by stifling it, or you can enable it to grow by nourishing it. So that's what I'd say about the self. Do you want to stop there, or do you want me to carry on and talk about determinism?
Oh, yes. If in your view, because there's a lot of view on free will, and even in spirituality, on agency or the doership, or what's your take on this theme?
My take is that a view of hard determinism, i.e. that everything is simply determined, is quite wrong. On the other hand, it would be foolish to deny that each of us is partly shaped, of course, by our genetic inheritance, and not only our genetic inheritance, because we seem to inherit things from our parents and our ancestors that are not present anywhere in the genes as far as we know. So we do inherit things, and also experiences are to some extent influential on the way we think and behave, of course. Nobody would deny that. But to go from there to saying that we have no choice, we have no agency, is just as wrong can be. Mm-hmm. And I believe Sapolsky, who's just written this book, Determined, is doing humanity a big disservice. I think it's fairly easy to argue against him, and I hope that people will do, because quite apart from its truth value, we know that when people believe that they are fully determined, various things happen. They become more arrogant and selfish. They become unhappy and gloomy, and they become less moral in their behavior. Why not, after all, if everything's just determined, then why not give in to whatever impulse comes along? But that is not my reason for opposing it. I mean, that is a good enough reason for thinking you ought to be careful before espousing it. But I think it is wrong because, first of all, from simply a point of view of physics, we know that the mechanistic idea that if you know the state of everything in the universe at a moment in time, and you know also the momentum of each particle, you can predict exactly what happens thereafter. This is effectively Laplace and other 18th century thinking. But due to advances in modern physics, we know that this is simply not the case. And we can talk about quantum indeterminacy. And one of the things people say is, well, you know, quantum indeterminacy, yeah, okay. But that's just at the very, very bottommost level, you know, the most reduced level. But once you get into the sort of the everyday level, quantum effects just disappear. That is not true. And I was very interested in a paper by a couple of physicists that I refer to in my work on the image of billiard balls colliding, which for a couple of centuries has been the sort of classic way of thinking about the mechanism of the universe. And they say that after a certain number of collisions, you cannot predict exactly what the next collision will be. Not because you don't have enough information, but because it is intrinsically unpredictable due to quantum phenomena. And I thought, well, very well, that might be true, but after how many collisions? Perhaps a million, perhaps 1,000 million, I don't know. The answer is, interestingly, 8.
Oh.
Yes. So we're already very much in the realm of the everyday. Added to that, there is no evidence that we are somehow programmed by our brains. This is a terrifically obvious error. There's this idea that came from the experiments of Benjamin Libet back in the 80s, I think, that he could register brain activity before the person was aware that they'd made a choice to move their finger. But I deal with that also in my book, and it's been refuted many times, and Libet himself didn't believe it, which is just as well because it's wrong. It's not that the brain knows before I do, it's that one's unconscious mind is aware of things before they're thrust into consciousness. And it's been estimated that 99.5, roughly, % of all the information that we have at our disposal is in the unconscious realm. It's there for us, but it's not in the focus of our consciousness. The focus of our consciousness is this left hemisphere, target-driven, narrow beam attention to something like just 3 degrees out of the 360 degrees of the circle. So it's seeing very, very little. But no, the unconscious mind is perfectly aware and has made a decision before you go, I can articulate what that is. And there are other problems with that experiment.
There's another question here. So if it's all not predetermined, what moves us? What makes us take decision, or what makes us have moral acts?
Gosh, another 2 very good, not entirely easy questions.
Sorry.
No. I mean, they're the best questions, of course. I don't want to be asked easy questions. The question of morality first, because it's a subset. It seems that there is something very deep in us, a moral sense, a sense of what is good, which is not at the level of calculation. And there are a couple of things to say about this. The first is that a moral sense is not only present in human beings. We know from the study of apes that they have a sense of fairness, that they are willing to forego things and even to starve themselves for long periods rather than do something that would give them food but would give an electric shock to a fellow monkey in another cage. And rather than do that, they will starve themselves. So they have a moral sense. And dogs, which have accompanied human beings for millennia, also have a moral sense and will put themselves in jeopardy in danger, in order to rescue an animal, not necessarily another dog. So there's that. But also, I believe very strongly that the emphasis in the Anglophone West on an analytic way of thinking in philosophy, which I'm glad to say the French and the German philosophers have transcended, is the problem with this is that it reduces everything to calculation. And it leads to very unsettling consequences. So, for example, a doctor has 5 patients who are waiting for organ transplants, without which they will die, but there are no suitable donors. And into his office comes one day a perfectly healthy man with a minor complaint, but he happens to know that this man is a perfect match for these donors. So should he kill this patient and allow 5 people to live, or just allow the one person to live? Now, according to a certain calculus, he not only should, but must kill that person. Now, this is utterly bonkers, as we say. One of the reasons for saying so is we don't want to live in a world where when we go to the doctor, we think the doctor's actually sizing us up for cannibalism. So there are problems like that, and trying to justify, for example, something really horrible like torturing an innocent child, because if it's put up on the dark web, there may be thousands of people who get pleasure from this horrific scene. And does that not outweigh the suffering of one child? Well, if I have to explain to you why that thinking is profoundly immoral, your basis of thinking about morality is not good. So I'm very against utilitarianism as a good guide. What I think more is that we need to see the whole of the situation in context, in something that, again, is called virtue ethics in the West. And it's a non-calculating way of thinking. That's what I think about morality, that it's something very deep in us. And I think it's responding to something that is there, and that as animals have become more sophisticated, and ultimately the most sophisticated, namely humans, this sense of morality, of what is good and what is not good, has expanded, has grown, has fructified. And, you know, an interesting question is, if a scientist like Dawkins thinks that the universe is pointless, meaningless, valueless, why does he so much value truth? Where does that come from? Because if the world really has no values and is just random actions, why should we not value making people happy over the truth? Sometimes truths can be quite painful, and it might be nicer just to say, oh, believe what you like, whatever fantasy, if it makes you feel happy. But he doesn't say that. Why does he not say that? And I think it's because he knows perfectly well that truth is a core value that we all have, and in every society is considered important, as a moral code is. And beauty is another. So I think we have, even animals respond to beauty, and certainly humans respond to beauty. And so these three Platonic virtues of goodness, beauty, and truth are values that I think we don't make up in order to comfort ourselves, but rather we discover, we literally uncover them. We find them, or we don't find them. And I think a human life that's fulfilled is one in which we do find them, and we respond to them, and we help them grow.
And that's fascinating. I'm a Buddhist, and
Yes.
it seems like the natural state of being described in some schools of Buddhism, where there's a ground of being naturally loving and caring and seeing the whole picture, and natural with natural actions, and you can find that also in Taoism with the Wu Wei and spontaneous loving action. That's so it's wonderful to have your view on that. And just to have a confirmation, is it a part of the more of the right hemisphere?
Approximately, yes. So the left hemisphere makes contributions, but the overall important part is the right hemisphere. And I talk in the Matter with Things about artists who had damage either to the right or the left hemisphere. And it seems clear that when the damage is to the left hemisphere, their creativity and their sense of beauty is not lost. But when the damage is to the right hemisphere, they become effectively less creative, and their work is less satisfying. But also we know from neuropsychological studies and from neuroanatomical examination of brains, that the practices of prayer and mindfulness and loving kindness meditation are very much underwritten by the right hemisphere in comparison with the left. And there is a Buddhist monk who is, by general consent, the sort of authority on meditation. He has a long name, which I'm afraid I can't ever quite remember. But he is, I think, a Rinpoche. And I quote a few sentences from him on mindfulness and point out the 23 things that he says that show that this is phenomenologically the world of the right hemisphere, not of the left, that is being cultivated. So yes, the practices of Buddhism do this. And I've just come back from Japan, which of course is a largely Buddhist culture. And interestingly, Shinto became sort of amalgamated with Buddhism, and the two live in harmony with one another, which I like very much. When two religions can go hand in loving partnership, not at war with one another. But there, what I found particularly moving was in fact not representation so much of the Buddha himself, but of bodhisattvas. So, as you know perfectly well, but not everybody who's listening may know, these are spirits that have achieved enlightenment, but forego the possibility of moving to a realm where they are simply detached from the business of earthly life, but stay in the sphere of the living in order to help living beings. I find this a beautiful idea, and it's somewhat like the Christian idea of the way the saints operate in the world.
Yes, and there's a practice where it's tantric practice in Tibetan Buddhism, where one sees himself as a bodhisattva and embody the qualities of wisdom and compassion. And it seems like that it can bring a sense of oneness or interconnectedness and natural loving that arises from that.
I'm sure that sounds exactly right to me. And I think that hence the importance of having spiritual practices. I think they're transformative. For me, probably the most important is prayer, which can mean many things, but I also do meditate in my own way using a mindfulness technique, which I find very important. So, yes, I think these things transform lives, but not just one's personal life, but they make an addition to the whole. You know, people think of themselves, oh, I'm just this one person in billions of people. What do I matter? And the world is so small in this vast cosmos. What does it matter? And I think this is typical left hemisphere thinking. I want to measure everything, and its value is its size. But this is not the case. Love cannot be measured, but some acts of love have transformed the world. So, I mean, fairly obviously, in the case of Christianity, the embrace of suffering and eventually death by Jesus Christ has, like it or not, transformed the world. So what you do, what you think, is by no means unimportant, and it changes the way you behave, and it makes you a better and more fulfilled person, but also does contribute to a better world for all of us. We don't know how powerful we can be just by attending to the world differently. And it's estimated that if only 3% of a population began to think in a certain way, that would help nourish and spread something that would catch fire, which would spread in the population. So we could be part of that 3%.
Back to the brain, I have a question because there's another two modes of describing the functioning of the brain. that is the default mode network and the task positive network. Is there a parallel with your work, or it's the same, or is it different?
You mentioned the default mode network. I didn't hear what your second.
Yes, the task positive network.
Okay, task positive. Yes. Okay. I mean, clearly these do relate to their identifiable state that we can image with MRI or whatever. But they don't directly relate to the hemisphere hypothesis. And I find them of interest, but not of life-changing interest. It's rather like something that is very interesting in the EEG. Now, what would that be in French? Do you know what an EEG is?
It's electroencephalogram, so EEG.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. EEG.
EEG.
EEG. Okay. In that, there is a good deal of alpha wave rhythm when you close your eyes. And when you open them and when you start thinking specifically, a lot of beta activity takes place. And for a long time, it was therefore thought that the alpha activity signified when the brain was idling, doing nothing. But actually, it was the time when the brain was doing everything. So the alpha waves are very, very important. They're a sign that the brain is not just focusing on a task or on focusing on what it can see, but it's actually holding together a whole lot of things. And once you either focus on something or open your eyes, this changes the way in which your brain is working to a more specific task-directed mode. So I think there's a sort of parallel there, and I think it's interesting, but as I say, it's not something that particularly has concerned me.
Yes, because I've written a memoir on this subject, so on the brain of enlightenment, and it's the most of the studies on experienced meditators turn around the shutting down of the default network, or the balancing between the two modes with non-dual meditation. That's a whole, and there's this idea that the balancing between the two modes helps us to be in the world, but not confused with it, and to be efficient. And the distinction seems really the critics of the first part of my memoir. I'm just doing it fast, but it's to say that the shutting down of the default mode network is not so a good thing, because you can't do some tasks. So it's a high achievement in meditation, but maybe it's not the whole thing. And it's just a note for this.
I like that, and it reminds me of the fact that in the normal waking state, the left hemisphere activity compared with right hemisphere activity is slightly greater, but that in meditation it becomes more, as you've just said, equalized. But the left hemisphere has an important role. It's just that it's not the dominant role, should never become the dominant role, because it doesn't understand very much. It's able to manipulate, but not really to understand. That is the role of the right hemisphere, which is why in the book titled The Master and His Emissary, the master is the right hemisphere, and that his emissary is the left hemisphere that does useful stuff. So you're quite right that in everyday life, we do need both of these. And the states that are brought about in meditation are not necessarily things that can be sustained over the long run. They're useful correctives for a while.
And you talked about alpha waves, and it reminds me a book I read some time ago. It's the Open Focus Brain. Maybe you know about it. It's meditative exercises to see space or imagine space, and it broadens the attention. So
Yes.
it's not so focused, but you can stay in this.
I don't know that actual book, but I think the idea is good. And one exercise in meditation, it sounds impossible, but is to hold one's attention steady on a certain place, a certain point, and at the same time allow oneself to be aware of the full expanse of one's attention, and so at the same time restricting and expanding. I think what that is doing is keeping the left hemisphere busy, so that it doesn't have time to get involved in and interrupt the right hemisphere. A lot of the time, what we need to do is put the left hemisphere to sleep for a while, to say, you do your stuff, that's good, be busy, but leave me to do something else bigger. The poet T.S. Eliot says somewhere something I like very much, that the meaning of a poem is the meat that the burglar tosses to the dog while he burgles the house. So the poem is burgling your mind. It's going there and getting things done. And the dog is the left hemisphere saying, no, I want to put it down to this. And while the dog is busy getting the meat, then the other work can happen.
Yes, it's an image that is that we can find in the contemplative traditions.
Can you?
Like, yes, it's like a sheep herder with different animals, and you have to have a broad view and also a focused one.
Yes.
And it's
Yes.
a balance between the two.
Yes.
I have a last question because we could talk like this for hours. I could. And but if you were to distill the essence of your work for those seeking clarity and deeper meaning in their life, what would you say is the most important takeaway from your work?
Well, to begin with, is massive evidence that there are three things that improve the quality of a human life, and they are being part of a cohesive social world where one trusts people and shares one's life with people. That's the first. The second is closeness to and immersion in the natural world. And the third is some connection with a world beyond this one, with the divine, with the sacred, with the holy, whatever one may call it, with God. And so those three things measurably, and the scientific literature is immense and completely cohesive, those three strands are massively important for improving cognition, for improving mood, for making people behave in a morally better way, and for physical health as well. In fact, having a connection with a divine realm is as efficient for physical health as stopping smoking, losing weight, and going to the gym. So it's not a reason for, if you try to just espouse, well, I suppose I'll pretend I've got a relationship. That is not going to be the right way to approach this. But those things are important. I say that at the outset. But then I think it's important to notice what is missing from your world. We tend to assume that things that people in the past seem to know, seem to observe, are due to their being more primitive than we are. and that somehow we are superior to them. I would like to invert that and say the reason we don't understand what they're talking about is not because we know so much, but because by comparison with them we know so very little. Yes, we know more science, that is quite true, but science doesn't answer the questions about what a human being is, what a life is for, what the world is like, what is nature, what is the divine, what fulfills a human being. These questions are not answered in that way, but they were almost intuitive to people living in the past. So ask yourself what it is that's been banished from your world, and whether it was right that it should be banished, and if it has, how you can bring it back into the world. So rather than have this dry, skeletal world in which all the flesh has been taken off the bone and you're rattling around like an image of the dead, what about embracing the things that give to life? Love, friendship, a sense of connection with the divine, a sense of connection with nature, poetry, music, art, architecture, ritual, myth, all the things that nourish the imagination. And don't think that the imagination is any more unreliable than other ways of getting at things. Science is reliable up to a point, but there are areas in which it cannot answer questions. Reason is very important up to a point, but there are things that reason cannot encompass, like why Mozart's G minor quintet is such a staggering piece of music. It's not rationally explicable, it's just supra-rational, not irrational. So see what it is that's been ruled out by our failure to attend to our intuitions, to our instincts about things, to our imagination. And imagination should be distinguished from fantasy. So fantasy is what takes us away from reality. Imagination is what takes us deep into reality. And indeed, without using the imagination, we can never really get into the true nature of what we're observing. It is by an act of imagination that we see what it is and understand where we are. So perhaps that is a small taste of things that we need to do, to be on the alert for what is going wrong and try to correct it. But there are bigger and deeper and more detailed things that obviously we can't say in this talk, but people would find if their English is good enough to read The Master and His Emissary. It's been translated into many languages, including Italian and Swedish and Romanian and Korean and Chinese and so on. But why has it not been translated into French or German? People say the trouble is the translation costs would be so high because these books are long.
Yes.
But I think it's a shame.
Thank you again for this wonderful conversation. It was a true pleasure for me. And I will try to put the video online for this year because I have to do the translation. And
yes.
And when it's done, I will send you the link.
Thank you.
And thank you again. And I have to say that I still didn't finish your book because it's very long. Your last book is
yes,
is very, very long, but it's fascinating. And one can just read some parts of it, and
yes,
it's enlightening. So thank you very much for it.
Thank you very much. And if I may say so, it's been a real pleasure talking with you. I feel that we have a meeting of minds, which is, we've only just met, but I like that very much. So
thank you very much. And I hope that we will have the occasion to work together or to speak again.
Bien sûr. I hope so.
Au revoir.
Au revoir. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.